Um, well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us the day before COP28 opens for this media briefing. Really appreciate your taking the time to be here. I'll just go through a couple of quick housekeeping items, and then we'll get into kind of the meat of it. My name is Vicky. I'm Communications Manager with Climate Action Network Canada, and I'm joined here today by my colleagues, our Executive Director, Brouillette, our Senior International Policy Analyst, Pratishtha Singh, and we're also really honored to be joined by Mohammed Adow from PowerShift Africa. So thank you so much all for taking the time to be here. As I mentioned, this is being recorded so that folks who aren't able to join us right now are able to get up to speed later on. And if you would like a copy of the recording, don't hesitate to send me a message. To start off with, Caroline is going to give us a bit of some of the context for COP28, our vision, our reasons for being here, and what we're hoping for from Canada and the context there. Then I believe Mo is going to get more into the kind of geopolitical context that we find ourselves in, and the key things that we're looking for at COP28 in terms of energy and in terms of finance. And Pratishtha is going to kind of help tie it all together and fill in the pieces on what specifically we're hoping for from Canada here. At that point, we'll open it up for some questions. And since it's a smaller crowd here today, we can be kind of informal about that. With that, I'll pass it over to Caroline.
Apologies, just rearranging my screen. Hi, folks. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I know that many will be watching this recording later, so appreciating as well your time and interest in this briefing. I'm joining from Dubai, where we're already seeing an unprecedented level of attention on the capture of the COP, not only this year, but over the years by the fossil fuel industry. COPs have been seeing increased scrutiny in past years, and in particular, the fact that this climate conference specifically is headed by an oil and gas CEO. I'm sure many of you as well have seen the news this past week around how the presidency has allegedly been using its title to conclude liquefied natural gas deals. These issues rightfully raise further skepticism about the conflict of interest that has been inherent to UNFC and UNFCCC processes over the years. So a lot of people are asking why we are, as civil society, attending COP this year. Less people are asking who benefits when civil society from across the world is not there to hold their governments and fossil fuel interests accountable. That's why we're here in Dubai. It's because civil society plays a huge role in keeping these interests accountable and in balancing the forces that have delayed climate action over the past years. This context also builds a bigger case for delivering an ambitious, robust, and equitable outcome that meets the moment. As part of the first ever global stocktake, COP28 must be a moment of reckoning for Canada and the world to match actions to words by phasing out all fossil fuels through a just transition, addressing the fiscal concerns of global South countries and the fundamental injustices and inequities at the center of our global system that leads to that, and championing climate finance to address climate impacts and adaptation and loss and damages specifically. So in particular, rich countries and large fossil fuel producers like Canada must end the failure to implement climate promises, that we've been seeing with the accumulation of reports telling us that we're not on track in past weeks. So specifically for Canada, what we'd like to see in terms of what it brings to the conversation this week. The first piece is that Canada, for now more than 2 years, has promised to cap emissions from the oil and gas sector. This sector has grown its emission by 88% since 1990, all the while other sectors have been picking up its slack. We're seeing Canadians currently suffer from the impacts of fossilflation, as well as devastating climate impacts that disproportionately affect Indigenous communities. And meanwhile, oil and gas executives and companies are raking in record profits. There's one policy that can finally tackle the elephant in the room in Canadian climate policy, and that is the cap on oil and gas emissions. And we must see it published, the framework for this policy must be published at COP, where we will be having globally some crucial conversation on the phase out of fossil fuels, a conversation where we've heard our Minister Guilbeault, say that he supports the phase out of unabated fossil fuels. Well, we need to see the domestic action to back those words. As well, this year at COP, we're seeing the first ever global stocktake under the Paris Agreement, where countries will not only be taking stock of the failures of the past years, but also charting a way forward that bridges the gaping holes in the implementation of climate promises. Canada has also its own accountability opportunity this year with the first progress report under our Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, our climate governance legislation, due by the end of the year. We need this report to be more than a glossy brochure and actually give us an accurate and transparent picture of how Canada is doing and how moving forward we are going to bridge that gap. So lots of parallels between the global stocktake and that progress report. And finally, Canada is a country from the global north who has a disproportionate historical responsibility for the climate crisis. So that means that we have a responsibility to respond to the fact that the climate finance that was so intrinsic to the compromise that was the Paris Agreement has not materialized over the years. That has meant not only that we've not seen this implementation gaps be filled, but that these injustices that are truly at the center of our conversations on climate justice have not been further bridged. Canada in the past has played a role in sometimes being a first mover within developed countries. We've seen Canada play that role last year on the loss and damage fund. We've seen Canada be the first this summer to put forward its new green climate fund contribution. We need Canada to do this as well as the major the other big negotiations outcome that we're hoping to see is the operationalization of the loss and damage fund. And that fund needs to be more than an empty bucket. And so Canada needs to be among those first movers and put money on the table, as that would send a strong signal of trust. Before I conclude, I want to say, given the context within which this COP is happening, because of the fact that we are only 2,500 kilometers away, where incredible violence is happening in Gaza, where thousands of civilians, mostly children, are being killed. Climate Action Network Canada has been calling for a complete ceasefire and is very concerned that Canada and other G7 countries' response to the situation reinforces the growing divide and distrust between global north and global south. Without a rapid de-escalation, the geopolitical and energy consequences of this violence, in addition to the devastating and direct human consequences that we're already witnessing, could really materialize within the climate negotiations we're going to be witnessing in the next few weeks, and the people on the front lines of these overlapping and converging crises cannot afford these setbacks. So Canada must truly join the call for an immediate ceasefire, as well as a call for the release of all hostages and an end to the occupation of Palestine. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Caroline. Over to Mohammed now.
Thank you, Vicky. Friends, I think it's important for us to recognize COP28 is at a turning point in history. This year, as we all know, is said to be the hottest ever recorded, as the impact of climate change, continue to bite around the world, and mostly in the most vulnerable countries that have contributed the least to cause the climate problem. But it's also possible that this meeting, in the heart of the Gulf fossil fuel industry, might actually be the place where we turn the tide on the climate crisis. There are three major things that we need to see progress in. And the first one, of course, is around fossil fuels, as Caroline has already mentioned. We've seen the COP presidency trying to dodge questions about a fossil fuel phase-out date, and instead claiming that countries are committing to voluntary tripling of renewables by 2030. And we know that would not be sufficient. I think what we need is a phase-out date for dirty energy. The ramping up of renewable energy is vital, but it's clear this is being used as a cover to avoid calling time on the fossil fuel industry. Unless renewables displace fossil fuels, we wouldn't be able to help hold global heating to below 1.5 degrees. We can't start to heal, while we carry on drinking poison, and that is effectively our dependence on fossil fuels means. And so, if we're going to call COP28 anything like a success, it has to help us actually hold countries to the commitment to phase out fossil fuels. And I think it's also important for us to recognize, while UAE, may be using this COP to try and greenwash, its vast fossil fuel operation and pretend that it's a force for good when it's actually a source of huge harm. It's not UAE alone, that is in this hypocrisy. Canada is also a major polluter. The USA is the biggest historic polluter, but also the biggest producer of fossil fuels. So there are many fossil fuel producers simultaneously expanding production of fossil fuels and claiming falsely to be climate leaders. You cannot be both. And so the United States, Canada, Norway, other major fossil fuel producers who have the financial and technological wherewithal needs to actually join in this call and demand a full, fast, and fair phase out of fossil fuels. History will judge, the COP and all the wealthy polluting countries harshly if they twist this opportunity in a way that will exacerbate the climate crisis. This year is likely to be the hottest year on record. And so it's vital we see COP28 deal with that emergency and set a phase out, date for fossil fuels. The second critical thing is what, Caroline also mentioned, which is loss and damage. At last year's, summit, few people thought we would get an agreement on a loss and damage fund at the start of the summit, but developing countries negotiated very hard and achieved a historic victory for the climate vulnerable countries. We need to build on that progress and see that fund established on the first day of the COP, with countries led by Canada, hopefully, pledging funds so that it can actually start to help people that are in desperate need. I think it's clear, that the COP presidency is keen to achieve an early win on loss and damage and get this over the line with world leaders, expected, hopefully, to announce financial pledges during their speeches at the weekend. And so hopefully Canada will join in that and commit not just establishing the fund as recommended by the Transitional Committee, but actually pledge real money to support the countries. On adaptation, I think you remember in COP26 in 2021 in Glasgow, rich countries pledged to double their adaptation finance. However, we're still waiting, while temperatures rise and climate impacts continue to worsen, the funding to help people adapt to these changes, has not grown to match the demand. I think it's a disgrace that many people that have done the least to cause the climate crisis are being left to fend for themselves. And hopefully COP28 can be the place where that changes. And those countries that pledge to, double adaptation finance can truly deliver. And then secondly, we can also agree on a global goal on adaptations with clear targets that allows us to actually work towards building our collective resilience as humanity. The final point I just want to raise is related to just transition. It's clear that the world needs to undergo an urgent transition from dirty to clean energy, to renewables energy. But this can't be a reckless or thoughtless shift. It needs to be done fairly. Countries that have caused the most harm and have the greatest wealth must do more and do it quickly. And that includes Canada. The idea of a just transition is often used in relation to workers, and that is important, in relation to workers in heavily polluting industries, usually in the global north. But we need to broaden this meaning and ensure a just transition for the world, so that those who don't even have fossil lock-in can actually be provided the incentive to leapfrog and develop in a clean manner. The part of the world where I come from, we have 600 million people without electricity, 1 billion people without access to clean cooking. But we also have incredible renewable energy potential. We have the latecomer advantage and an opportunity to leapfrog and become a green leader. And so there is an opportunity here in broadening the framing of just transition, while at the same time delivering for workers in heavily polluting industries and in heavily polluting countries, but also incentivizing those who are largely clean, but also poor and lacking energy, can actually leapfrog. And that is something I hope COP28 can actually deliver. So we have a real opportunity, and I hope we will see an outcome that unites the world in these very difficult times when there's a lot of division. And the fact that we're going to the Middle East in a country that is largely built on fossil fuels, should hopefully give us hope that we will not only come together with the negotiators, working to protect their national interest, but that we will actually have an outcome that helps to rebuild faith in international cooperation for climate, but also for global peace. I think this extra scrutiny that we will have in Dubai is going to helpfully not just salvage international cooperation on climate, but actually international cooperation for the good of the world and for the good of everyone on this planet. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mohammed, for that really clear articulation of the key elements that are needed to make COP28 a success. I'll pass it over to Pratishtha now.
Thanks, Vicky. And yeah, again, honored to be part of this panel. And I think Carol and Mohammed eloquently shared and touched on different important pieces pertaining to COP28, but maybe I'll start adding some thoughts and emphasis on some of the points that Carol and Mohammed you made. So maybe starting Carol, you mentioned about COP28 being a moment of reckoning for the world and Canada. And we believe that, yes, this is the moment for Canada to decide to lead on the talks, match its actions to its worth, not just internationally, but also domestically. We are seeing a lot of cries also here at home. In order for Canada to deliver on much of the domestic policies. And an international stage, of course, the developing countries are expecting rich countries like Canada to shift the course and do their part. So anything less will put the success of this COP in Dubai at risk, and also their own credibility at risk. And you mentioned about the moment, the complex geopolitical challenges that the world is facing and the polar crisis, which truly demands the strengthening of the multilateralism process at the UNFCCC space, and more dialogues and peace and democracy to be put into the process. So my clear message for Canada is we believe that Canada has the capacity, ability, and the obligation to look at the climate finance as an issue of transformation, to deliver and keep the 1.5-degree goal alive, as well as to respond to the worst impacts of the climate change in the most vulnerable regions of the world, and to reflect and match the ambition both domestically and internationally. I think it's clear that many countries and communities across the world are forced to make tough social and economic choices in the face of food, energy, and the cost of living crisis, as well as the worsening climate impacts. And that's why the progress on climate finance in 2023 makes utmost importance, and that demands immediate efforts from the rich countries like Canada to close the finance gap. We have seen progress in the past couple of years from Canada, moving from being like a worst climate finance performer to the one who's actually trying to bridge like the conversation. So we welcomed Canada's and Germany efforts to give an update on the progress of delivering on the goal of 100 million. And we had the recent OECD report, but I think also it does little to rebuild the trust levels within the developing countries in the world of crisis that we are in today. Mohammed, you like touched already on like adaptation and loss and damage. So yeah, it's time that the rich nations pay their dues in forms of grants, in forms of public funding that is additional, transparent, accountable, and predictable. And we saw the constructive role played by Canada during COP28 in the establishment of the loss and damage fund, but an empty fund is no use for anybody. So yeah, we need countries like Canada to use this opportunity to pledge to make an initial contribution to this fund and get this fund up and running. So that's one of our key demand from Canada to actually deliver, and we will be looking forward to the plenary tomorrow. So yeah, I'll stop there and look forward to answering questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much. We'll open the floor for questions from media now, and I might just add, I know that Mohammed, you need to be leaving to head to Dubai very shortly, so if you have any questions for Mohammed specifically, maybe ask those first. Feel free to either raise your hand or go ahead and unmute yourself. Yeah, we've got one from Davis Legree from iPolitics.
Hi, thanks for taking our questions. Yeah, just one for Carolyn, considering you're already in Dubai. I was just wondering if you could kind of put the size of the fossil fuel delegation this year into context. I know that's been a concern in previous years. Just wondering if their presence is palpable once again this year.
Thanks so much, Davis. I'm really happy to answer that, but I want to make sure that we let Mohammed go catch his flight first. So I might just hold off on that, see if there are questions for Mo, and then answer you.
Sure. Sorry.
And yeah, other panelists might want to take this as well.
Any questions for Mohammed before we let him go get on a plane? All right, then if not, maybe if you have questions that come up later, you're welcome to send those to me and I can pass those inquiries along, as I'm sure there will be lots to say and talk about over the next couple of weeks. Thanks so much, Mohammed, for joining us today. If you've got any closing thoughts, feel free to share them, but otherwise we'll let you go.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say, possibly as a pretext for what Karen might say, is that fossil fuels are, after all, the elephant in the room. And, fossil fuel lobbyists, including countries that are heavily dependent on fossil fuels, including Canada, will go trying to pretend that they're not a problem, which is why we may end up with more delegates from that industry than ever before. And I think it's also understandable if the COP host and other fossil fuel nations were starting to feel the heat, because the rest of the world are actually looking at how they're going to try and greenwash in Dubai. And so if anything, the fact that we have this COP in Dubai must be cause for concern for any well-meaning, climate concerned citizen of the planet. I think UAE and generally the Gulf states and oil-producing countries will try and greenwash, their vast, fossil fuel resources. And they may even sell us, the tripling of renewables as, the big outcome of Dubai, which might also be voluntary. But history will judge them very harshly if they don't seize the opportunity of a COP in the Gulf, in an oil-producing country that doesn't deliver a phase out on fossil fuels, so that we can have a managed and orderly transition from fossil fuels. Because the more the planet continues to heat, the more we're likely to transition. But if we don't do it fairly and fast, we're going to have a very disorderly and unmanaged transition. And that is the opportunity that, you know, Dubai has, and if they don't seize and, you know, help us actually deliver language on a fossil fuel phase down in the early days of the COP, so that we can actually work to secure it. If you've been a COP veteran, you know that that is likely to go to the wire in the final hours of the COP. And that is something they can avoid and spend a good chunk of the time, including when, you know, government leaders are in Dubai, to actually help set the expectation that Dubai has to be the place that delivers the transition. We've had the president of the COP talk about the transition as inevitable. So this is a test whether they really meant that, and whether they will actually create the space to help us realize that opportunity. All the best. Vicky, I'm happy to take questions. So email me if anything comes up, and I will be happy to engage anyone if any other questions crop up. All the best.
Mohammed.
Yes, Mike.
Sorry, just jumping. Vicky, do you mind if Mohammed, do you have time? And Vicky, may I ask one question? Thank you. Mohammed Mitchell Beer from the Energy Mix in Ottawa. Thank you for that, because it triggered this question. What we hear in Canada, and I'm sure in other rich countries, is the line or the spin that it's easy enough for us to sit here in the rich north and say decarbonize immediately, but after all, we need this for people in developing countries, for people in Africa who don't have access to energy. And the fossil industry, I think, has been very adept at trying to put that position forward. Also, either at last year's COP or the previous, we saw a news conference involving fossil executives from Africa alongside their counterparts in Canada, trying to make that case. Could you please elaborate on what that looks like from the ground up, and yeah, just discuss. Can you answer that position from fossil companies both here and there?
Mohammed, you're on mute right now.
Sorry, I didn't realize. So what I wanted to say is, it's true that the fossil fuel producing countries are now turning their sights on Africa. You know, it's like that the tobacco companies basically, they work very hard to, you know, hook the next generation. They know very well, you know, the lethal nature of their cigarettes, yet they continue to get millions of teenagers hooked on them. And that's exactly what the fossil fuel producers are trying to do, wanting to actually exploit the tragedy of Africa's poverty so that they can actually enslave, you know, countries that are largely clean because they're poor to fossil fuels. And it's this enslavement that will actually pour further misery on countries like those in Africa, because these countries are already suffering from, you know, the fossil fuel, you know, climate change. And I think that is repulsive, to exploit the poverty of the developing countries and try and hook them on the dirty stuff when they know it's harmful, at a time when the rest of the world, including Canada, is trying to clean and wean itself of fossil fuels. If you look at the historic polluters that have emitted the bulk of the emissions, they all have a net zero target. They're all developing, you know, to transition in the next decade. And the reason increasingly why poor countries, including those in Africa, are desperate and they're falling for this trick largely rests on the failure of the historic polluting countries to honor their climate finance pledges. You know, these countries have been promising financial support to the developing countries in dealing with the impact of climate change, in transitioning to, you know, sustainable development, but the deadlines have been missed. The amount of money that they've been providing have been insufficient. And a lot of this money is made up of loans rather than grants. And if you look at the cost of capital, especially in Africa, it's 5 times higher than other countries. And this leads to debts, distress, and imperils, you know, our future. And that is why African countries may fall for the trick. And that is not going to be right, especially given that the reason that these countries are in this desperate position is largely because of the failure of the polluting class to honor their climate debt. And so in short, I think what we need to do is seize the opportunity and help chart a clean path, not just for the polluting world, but for the whole world. If I give you an example, in the case of Africa, we have some of the best renewable energy resources. We have the best strategic minerals that are needed for decarbonization. This can help to develop, the developing world cleanly. But we need investment from rich countries that claim to be climate leaders. We cannot deliver climate ambition without unlocking financial support for the developing countries. And that is the challenge that the developing countries have. And that is a theme that the fossil fuel lobbies and the fossil fuel producers are exploiting. And so as we call them out, we should also call out the historic polluters for not honoring their climate pledges. Those two things go hand in hand. There's no point calling out Saudi for the hypocrisy to want to hook us on their dirty stuff if you're not going to blame Canada and the USA and Europe for not delivering sufficient climate finance that incentivizes clean development. So I hope I've answered your question, but that's a challenge that the developing world faces.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that.
All the best, friends. Bye-bye for now. And see you in Dubai soon.
Thanks so much, Mohammed. Thank you. Safe travels.
Thanks so much.
All right. Yeah,
Oh,
so maybe, sorry, I think we're having a bit of a lag here. Maybe, Keho, you can address a bit of Davis's initial question, and then Stephen Lee, he has also put another question in the chat. Will the role of civil society at this COP be constrained by the host country or by basic logistics? So we can go there next, and afterwards take the question from Global News.
Thanks a lot for that. Davis, to your question, it's a bit early for us to be able to see and feel the impact of fossil fuel industry delegations right now. I do want to say that, however, this year, as part of a small win of a broader campaign from civil society pushing for the UNFCCC space to have a to put in place a conflict of interest policy in place, it was announced in June that all parties registering for COP28 have been required to disclose their affiliation. So that will help the annual kind of accounting of how many fossil fuel lobbyists are present. What I will say is that in terms of this year and the impact on negotiations and the space, is that fossil fuel industry presence during COPs is not a new phenomena. Recent research that was published by Corporate Accountability last week showed that over the past 20 years, 7,200 delegates had been registered by the largest fossil fuel firms and their trade representative, their trade groups. And so while this year, what's really different and makes that conflict of interest so much more visible is that an oil and gas CEO is heading the talks. As Mohammed has said, that has increased scrutiny and made this conflict of interest more visible, and then creating more pressure on the presidency and on negotiators to prove that this process can still work and can deliver a robust, ambitious, equitable outcome that includes a just transition away from all fossil fuels. So that's perhaps what I will say this year. I also want to note that last year, many CAN-Rac members were leading a campaign calling out the fact that oil and gas companies were being platformed at the Canadian Pavilion. This campaign has been successful, as we saw this year that there are no events coming from oil and gas companies or their lobby groups being planned at the Canadian Pavilion. Stephen, on the role of civil society being constrained by the host country. As we know, and this is a story that is somewhat similar to what we experienced last year in Egypt, there are limitations on political rights in the UAE, which means that civil society actions and protests will be restricted to the UN space. COPs need to travel around the world. It's an important part of our multilateral process and of global cooperation that different countries get to host them, and that they are not always in the same Northern Europe countries that might fulfill some certain standards. This said, civil society will still be highlighting these issues around human rights, around political rights, because climate justice cannot be met if the human rights of everyone are not met.
Thanks, Caroline. Over to Global News. I'm not sure who that is from Global, so
Hi.
Come in and introduce yourself. Thanks.
Hi. Yeah, sorry about that. It's Abigail Beeman with Global National. My question is for Caroline. You talked about how there's an opportunity for a stock take of the Paris Agreement and bridging some of the gaping holes there. And I'm wondering, Caroline, if you can sort of summarize from your perspective, from Climate Action Network's perspective, just how Canada is doing in terms of where we are and some of those gaping holes.
Thanks so much for that, and I'd invite my colleague Pratishtha to step in after on issues related to adaptation and loss and damage. But I think in the past weeks, and we see this cycle happen year after year after year, we have this series of reports coming from the UN and credible scientific sources that pile up about various implementation gaps of our climate promises. We have the implementation gap, we have the production gap, we have the adaptation gap, we have the land gap. And so as a climate activist, it becomes increasingly difficult to find something new to say. And now what we really need to do and see from governments is what they're going to do about it and how they're going to do it. On Canada's end, there has been one sector that has been sitting out climate action on the bench, while other consumers, other producers, other sectors are actually decreasing their emissions. And that sector is the oil and gas sector. The solution to finally tackling that elephant in the room of Canadian climate policy and making sure that the oil and gas industry is not coasting while the rest of our economy is putting all hands on deck is to cap oil and gas emissions. We know that we cannot meet our 2030 target without this cap on oil and gas emissions. We know as well from recent research from the IEA that it will be extremely difficult to reach our 2050 net zero targets without that sector doing its fair share of the national climate effort. We're at COP28, where, as Mohammed has said so eloquently, the conversation on the phase out of fossil fuels is everywhere. And so Canada, if it wants to be taken seriously within those conversations, needs to back its actions by words and present a robust framework cap on oil and gas emissions that includes a target that forces the sector to do its fair share of the national climate effort. Pratishtha, I perhaps can speak on adaptation and loss and damage. I'm sorry, Vicky, I don't want to play your role here.
No, that's great. Pratishtha, did you have anything to add on those other elements of where we're falling short?
Maybe I'll just say, like, to wrap up, like Carol's comment. So, like, yeah, first ever global stock take, it will give like an assessment of the gaps, but we also see it as like an opportunity where the international cooperation and multilateralism, could be deepened. So what we really hope to come out like as an outcome is like an ambitious and a balanced kind of like text coming out of the GST, where we have like a balance across like different strands, like in mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and like more kind of like language on how the monitoring and the review would be carried out. So like having those elements would be like the core of the GST outcome this year.
Thanks so much, Pratishtha. Abigail, did you have a follow-up or any other questions that you'd like to ask?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. I guess I would just ask to both of you or to whoever wishes to take this. Given Canada's size, as a middle power, how much impact do you think we can have on the world stage to actually move the needle at COP? You talked about more attention on COP this year. Do you think that Canada can make an impact that has our country stand out this year?
Great question. Pratishtha, do you want to start by addressing this? And Caroline, if there's anything you'd like to add, you can come in after.
Yeah, that sounds good. Carol, feel free to follow me in. But to us, we think that this is the moment for Canada to actually step up and be like a leader in this space. Like we know, like Canada has also been filling in for the UN Human Rights Council seat. We have seen the leadership from Canada on various issues like pertaining to even the phase out of unabated fossil fuels, or we talk about like adaptation or the conversations on loss and damage. And I feel within the global North countries, Canada has really set like those expectations, and the global South is really looking up to Canada to continue playing that constructive convening role in these negotiations. When we are realizing the fact that there are also some countries, global North countries, which are not very helpful in the negotiations. So we see Canada playing that bridge building role in the negotiations and making sure that we get a strong, ambitious outcome, that addresses like the needs and the concerns and the priorities of those, who are most vulnerable and on the front line and dealing with the climate impacts.
Thanks, Pratishtha. Caroline, anything to add?
I actually don't have a lot to add. I thought that was a great response.
Great. Any last questions from anyone here? Feel free to raise your hand, or again, just unmute and go ahead. Yeah, Mitchell.
Thanks again. Adow, you mentioned that this year no oil and gas companies or lobby groups will be platformed at the Canadian Pavilion. Need anyone even ask, are you going to be keeping an eye, for example, on the Saskatchewan Pavilion?
Great question, Mitchell. I think as part of those fossil fuel interests that we've seen exerting a fiercer grip on negotiations and on the space in past years, we need to recognize that fossil fuel lobbyists take different forms. And one of those forms is the form of politician. We have heard that Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, is coming to COP this year to platform her province's fossil fuel friendly plan. We know that Saskatchewan is having its own pavilion this year because it was unsatisfied, and I don't have much details on that, but by the services provided by the Canadian Pavilion. CAN-Rac members and allies will be keeping a close look on Canada's subnational government's tactics of delay, disruption, and greenwashing in the COP space. I think it's essential in a federation that is as decentralized as Canada that we make sure and that we push for all jurisdictions to do as much as they can on climate action. I also want to say that what makes it really sad when politicians start prioritizing the interests of oil and gas CEOs rather than the public interest is that that's not that's often, and I would say in this day and age, that's always not what people are actually wanting. And in the case of Danielle Smith, there's very interesting polling that we can share in the chat that shows that Premier Danielle Smith's positions on the energy transition is completely out of line with what Albertans actually want. So I hope that the question of whether Albertans and the people of Saskatchewan, whether their interests are being well represented, and who these politicians are representing, will be asked clearly of them at this COP.
Thanks. Any follow-ups or final questions? Mitchell, I see you've unmuted again.
Just to say thanks for this briefing.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again to everyone who joined. Maybe I'll just go through a couple of notes on what you can expect from us over the next couple of weeks as COP continues. Don't hesitate to reach out to set up interviews, either with members of the CAN-Rac team or with other voices from Canadian civil society. We have quite a broad and diverse membership of our network and many allies whom we work closely with as well. So please feel free to reach out to us if you're looking to be connected to any specific kinds of voices, and we'll do our best to make that happen. We'll also be sending out daily updates throughout COP, and if you've registered for this briefing, I assume that you're planning on following COP fairly closely, so I'll put you on the distribution list. But if you have any colleagues who would like to receive that as well, don't hesitate to let me know, and I will add them there. I'll also just put in the chat here the written briefing that we've prepared and that was shared by in the media advisory that went out for this, so that you can reference that if it's useful. Thanks again. I'll just see if Caroline and Pratishtha, you have any closing thoughts that you want to share before we let you get on with your days.
Nothing comes to mind. I don't know if it's jet lagged or just that I had the pleasure of being with such a brilliant panel. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Great. Well, have a good evening here or day for those of you back home, and I'm sure we'll be in touch soon. Take care.